Я рад приветствовать вас и рад, что мы...
This is the list of speakers, and I'm so happy that we've been able to draw such a huge audience to discuss something so hyped up.
Вся тема. Я хочу, чтобы мы стали...
So,
Короче,
let's start anew.
мы хотим
So,
системы.
founders and developers get together,
Сейчас
and we want to discuss crypto for AI. It probably sounds pretty weird because, everybody's using ChatGPT and, we are serving it all sorts of confidential information, and we seem to be content with that. Now, in the agentic world, we have finally started thinking whether we are comfortable giving our wallets away to those agents. Maybe not.
что мы
So
можем...
the big question here is whether we are able to build something in this future.
Для того, чтобы...
And, what kind of a place we can potentially have in this future. So I've brought together these great speakers. I'm happy that they all agreed to come here. Let me introduce Vladimir Okay, dear panelists, can you please tell us a bit about the technologies in that field?
Приватности, секьюрности, безопасности.
So in terms of privacy and security of AI, what's there we should know? I'd like Vladimir to tell us briefly about SDKML, which is obviously a very popular topic. You know, if you search for it on Twitter, for example,
Чудовищ.
you can learn about it actually beating down some monsters.
На мой взгляд, это
I wouldn't really claim it's popular. I think it's a very niche thing.
и он является как бы такой частью более общей темы, как я сказал.
Moreover, I see it as a subset of computation integrity. So you imagine that you outsource,
Как вы
you
можете
know, some compute to somebody so that, you know, they calculate, you know, do some formulas for you, do some multiplication rounds.
не вычисляя повторно,
How do you check the quality of their work if you do not want to repeat the same
пример
kind of motions? You can use checksums, for example, right?
решения судоку или каких-то кроссвордов.
So, for example, you can check if a Sudoku or a crossword puzzle has been properly completed, or if Waldo has been properly found, and so on. So, in a nutshell, we
Выполнять те же самые действия, да, то есть
are trying to learn whether a particular, say, task or puzzle has been correctly done without repeating all the moves. Say, you ask ChatGPT to draw a kitten for you.
собственно, полезной работы, рисование котика,
Besides doing the useful work, which is drawing a kitten,
как вот есть для файла.
we also want the system to produce a checksum, like you would have in a digital signature, in, say, your text statement or text return, or like in a file. And checking the checksum is much easier than redrawing a kitten.
Удостовериться в том, что, например,
Thanks to that,
ChatGPT,
users should be able to check whether this kitten has indeed been produced by ChatGPT, as opposed to, say, being some intellectual property somebody's stolen.
кому в голову
I understand that the case I'm giving you sounds very far-fetched,
или
and it is. But now think about credit scoring,
диагностика заболеваний по МРТ, то
or maybe some MRI-based disease diagnostics.
LLM-революции очень интересовал вопрос,
Before the LLM revolution, I was very, very interested in biometric authentication and verification thereof. So imagine that as a user, you're taking a photo of your face and you need to prove that the person you've just taken a photo of is the same, that is maintained in a number vector
проверить, что дистанция
on the server. Like 5 people are only allowed to enter a particular building,
X.
and I want to prove that the distance between what I'm submitting and some canonical vector is small enough.
Потому что на том конце
Then I don't need to trust that the server is doing its job properly.
гипотеза
It's all being done without any additional trust hypothesis being invoked. So this checksum is effectively what I'm talking about.
внутри себя как бы вот эту штуку, там обычно это вывод,
And the protocol that's wrapped around that, and it could be, for example, an output of a neural network or some other model, you know, sort of an inference, if you like.
разглашением.
So this is effectively a zero disclosure kind of proof protocol.
Ну,
So
более сложно,
I've been working in convolutional neural networks. It is much more difficult to apply it to more sophisticated models,
где модель попроще.
but you can apply it in so many other areas.
Для товарища разработчика, какой вообще пример,
Now, for the developers among us,
как она строится?
what should be, you know, the kind of interaction
Так, единственное,
with the
что,
what we've been talking about? Well, it's pretty much the same. On the model provider's side, you know, for those who do, say, biometric authentication,
если у меня есть телефон, на котором
like think about my case about entry to a building. I have a phone that's sporting some Face ID system, but maybe it's a Face ID on steroids.
true false,
So rather than just giving me a flag true or false, it will also generate a checksum.
сейчас, да,
Unlike the current Face ID,
Сбербанк или там Positive Technologies не будет доверять тому, что
Sber or Positive Technologies
никуда перед...
are not really going to trust what Face ID says.
Да, доказательства мы
But the checksum
которые можно куда-то отправить.
based on, zero disclosure proof. This can be swapped, or this can be
Госуслуги. Или наоборот, там, типа там... Я...
sent to a third party, like Gosuslugi, which is like a Russian e-government services
Встроенного доверия к тому...
agency or service.
Предоставлял эту модель, например, к Apple. Или к девайсу, на котором...
So this way we won't really depend on, say, Apple or the other device manufacturer.
Для данных... Да, когда...
So this is exactly what we are doing for data when we append our digital signature.
Дайджест мы ставим как бы некую подпись.
So we first digest the data and then we attach it a signature that guarantees the authenticity and the integrity.
Много вопросов есть, но
Thank you.
можете обсудить с Владимиром.
So many questions already, and I'm certain you will be able to discuss your questions with Vladimir a bit later.
Trust Execution Environment. И
So there is the so-called trust execution environment.
да,
I know you've been very interested in that. Can you please provide us with an overview of technologies there?
Ну, то есть TI, они были сделаны изначально,
These
по-моему, для защиты.
were initially developed
Ну, то есть,
to
были маленькие
kind of foolproof humans. I think these were initially small chips embedded in devices
если я- у меня
so that people could securely store secret passwords. Like on my iPhone, there is TEE chips storing my passwords so that somebody who gets access to my phone
Вот. Суть в том,
should not have an easy time stealing my passwords.
можно вычислить какую-то программу,
So it's effectively a secure environment.
железо для внешнего человека, который не имеет секретного ключа от этого отшифрования этого environment. Ну, все, что там происходит, это black box.
Which is effectively a black box to everybody except for the owner. So you can send information there, do some computation, get the output. Modern AMD CPUs
Когда
enable you to switch the secure mode on
то есть ты можешь
so that
систему, ты можешь запустить там
you can run a whole operating system in a secure mode.
обычно запускаешь в обычном режиме, ты
So all the things you would be doing there in a regular way, you can be running in secure mode.
для себя ты защищаешься только от
Now, if you're only doing it for yourself, you are securing yourself
внешнего воздействия по отношению
against an external
какое-то физическое взаимовоздействие,
attack, for example.
условно говоря.
да.
So if it's lost and hacked,
Про AI, то современный GPU, там, начиная с H100, H200 и так далее, вот,
so modern GPUs, starting with H100 or H200 from NVIDIA, they do have TEE mode as well.
не очень большой перформанс-дроп дает, то есть можно в этом
And the performance drop associated with it is not too significant. So you can run your models there, you can do your inferences,
получается, который
and the performance there is comparable to that in the regular mode.
например,
Why is it there?
Apple и сейчас, возможно, какие-то другие компании тоже у себя
From
вкладывают
what I know, both Apple and potentially some other companies, when they run, some models in their clouds, they run them in TEE mode to state that this is their value proposition. Now, you know what? We are very careful with your data. Like, even if we are training somebody on your data, to provide inference, we're doing it in secure mode so that neither us nor our system administrators can see the innards of your confidential information. So this is one of the
мы делаем некоторую
key trends in this world now.
данных клиентов.
It's about insulating client data from provider hardware.
Сейчас
Is that more about CPUs or GPUs?
Ну, по-моему, есть два больших use cases. То есть один use case,
There are two primary use cases.
то есть, например,
One is about the keys.
люди, которые строят
So in Web3, for example,
computation,
those who do multi-party computations, PC wallets,
ключей и так далее, то есть
distributed storage of private keys, so they will be building those nodes that store shares of private keys and hardware that is equipped with TE chips.
какая диаграмма взаимодействия у TE-чипа получается? Или он только...
So how is a TE chip used? Is it just processing part of data? I'm sorry, I'm not positioned to answer this question.
Мы делаем
May I?
multi-party computation для ключей.
We do multi-party computation for keys and wallets. We do not use TEE because
Причем,
Here you are effectively putting your trust in the developer.
когда Intel впервые выпустил
There was a moment when Intel, for the first time ever, produced Intel SGX, and Intel SGX would send telemetry and request for registration straight to Intel.
и из-за этого
And that was pretty criminal, if you ask me. Nobody liked that.
криптографическое решение
You know, they introduced an elegant cryptography to address that.
эллиптических кривых, это очень такая редкая
So, you know, they did this very niche thing, like elliptical curve pairing based. So they introduced it in their CPUs to camouflage and obfuscate that, you know, this registration request is coming from such and such user, and this thing is now running on billions of devices. However, you can actually attack it
доверять
through like third-party channels.
производителя.
So you sort of have to rely here on the provider's supply chain. There have been at least 2 cases with Intel
То, что у меня Intel SGX,
Две, которые...
where I'm sort of masquerading,
как бы, если ты пользуешься
at least 2 attacks that we know.
удаленным сервисом, который
So where I can masquerade as SGX.
они просто, ну, то есть это фейк.
So you can pretend that you have SGX when in fact you don't.
Такой easter egg, только с криптографией.
So it's a kind of Easter egg in the world of cryptography. There is another great narrative related to federated systems that Yuri will be talking about. I know a couple of groups that are doing research even now in Russian, and Yuri has been involved with, you know, linking it all to blockchain. So can you please tell us more about federated systems? If we're talking about federated learning, we are talking about training neural networks or LLMs. What do we need to train a model like this? Well, we need access to data, preferably big data. We need an algo, and we also need to compute a lot. We're not that interested in the algo itself at the moment, but we are interested in data. And we also need lots and lots of machine hours for the train to happen. Now, it's one thing if you have access to an external model, like you've bought access to ChatGPT. If you're fine with that, that's perfect. But, you know, some companies want to own their own models, which means that, you know, they got to develop or at least retrain their models. Now, imagine that you don't have the data or you don't have the compute power in order to train the model that you need over a sensible amount of time. Then it would make a lot of sense for you to, you know, get access to, you know, providers' data or providers' compute capacity. And this is the case that we call federated learning, where rather than learning in a centralized way, you federate it so that eventually all the participants of such a project would have access to the same model and will also, you know, have reasons to trust this model. What we have been doing lately, and I should probably mention here, like, why do we trust some things but not others? Like with open source data, it's easier to trust when you have the sources in public access. But then, you know, with open architecture, you can still spend a lot of time fine-tuning the weights. Now, if you open the weights, that's much better, for sure, but is there a guarantee that no data has been maliciously fed to the model during the train stage to skew it? So ideally, we want to have a transparent train process so that nobody can introduce any skews or biases, so that no data is censored out.
А на самом деле не хотите рассказывать о каких-то особенностях в данных. И вот, собственно, мы таким направлением занимались.
And this is exactly what we have been doing.
Нужны и в том числе современные криптографические примитивы по...
And it turns out that you need some modern cryptographic primitives for, say, distribution of randomly generated numbers, so that all together as a federation we can generate those random numbers.
окончания приема ставок. До этого момента никто не получал доступ.
And until a certain moment, for example, let's call it the end of bid collection stage, nobody gets to see what his bids are. And since there is a need also for a public board where we can publish stuff, blockchain sounds like the best candidate for that. That's why we decided to put it all in the blockchain.
Вот мы создали федерацию, которая каждый обладает
Okay, so we have this federation. No, let me put it like this.
разных
So
банков.
we have an agglomeration of different banks.
Есть юзер.
And these banks
Заур хочет взять кредит.
have a user named Zaur. Zaur wants to take a loan out.
В сетах данных
So
определить
let's assume that, they want to actually use this particular application to train their system. So Bank A provides information to the federated learning system, or will this information stay there, or will there be a gradient of it left? You must be talking about the inference stage here.
Банки
Now,
хотят
the use case for federative learning here will be like this. The banks want to train a single model for all the banks, but each bank has its own data set,
в одном, например,
has its own set of users. So, for example, Zaur can be a client of a particular bank, say OTP or Sber. So,
об этом пользователе, собственно, они вошли на этапе обучения, но при этом другие банки
we want the data on him to be available during the train stage without the other banks getting access to personally identifiable information users.
на самом деле
That's certainly a good case for federated learning. In fact, you don't even need AI here.
какие-то методы более классические использовать, такие как
You can use the more classic tools here,
извлечение информации.
such as, private extraction of information from databases using homomorphic encryption.
Конкретного пользователя подставляли. Иногда и чаще, и популярнее мы хотим обезличивать данные, и вот как
In most cases, you'll probably want to anonymize the data and serve it to the model.
нам
Now, to train the model, you don't really need to know what the raw data says,
градиентный спуск
because we do have a stochastic gradient decline, which tells us how we need to identify a sample and for it, calculate the weights for the model,
просто обмениваться вот этими градиентами.
thus arriving at a derivative of the model. So in a federated learning, we will be exchanging gradients. Can you extract information on primary data from a gradient like this? That's a tough question. It will really depend on the size of the data set. So the bigger the data set, the more difficult it will be to extract such data, and whether additional techniques have been used in order to anonymize it. Such an attack vector is technically possible.
Информацию об исходной выборке.
So out of the gradient that you provide to the Federation, there is a probability that some PII can be extracted. So you got to manage this risk.
сейчас не все возможные технологии
Obviously, we are not trying to showcase all the technologies out there because there is also MLMPC.
быть использованы частично в других кейсах, но MLMPC тоже может быть, и существуют еще там всякие новые разработки. Но главное,
And there are some more newfangled developments as well.
скажем,
Some of us,
части и бизнесовая часть, которая
at least those on the product side,
потратит
who are considering, like, why would we want to spend several years of our lives
непонятно,
and several years of life of our most expensive employees
получить что,
in order to do what? In order to get what? When it's not even guaranteed there will be user demand for that.
существует ли для федеративной системы, для других технологий, которые мы обсуждаем, какой-то
For technologies like this,
в какую сторону мы вообще идем? Для
is there demand for, say, federative learning or something else? Why are we building it for ourselves, in other words?
Идет от больших корпораций, которым
I think the demand is coming from large corporations that want to have their own private models.
иметь свои приватные модели. Ну, потому что
Why would they want to have their private models?
они
Well, for them, it's a matter of,
также еще на данные. Потому
it's a kind of a commercial secret, something that underpins their business. Secondly, we've all been collecting big data for the past 2 decades or more. And recently, we learned to feed huge amounts of data to LLMs, which is great. Now imagine that you feed all this to AI. Soon you will discover that it contains a lot of junk. Now we do know that you should not readily trust anything you read on the internet. So for the more specialized, narrow focus kind of tasks, you may want to go for the sanitized, cleaner data sets. And many companies will want to train their models from scratch using that, or maybe to fine-tune some existing models. The price of such clean data is much higher than the price of random data. Now, to go back to a hypothetical example of banks, banks can potentially have access to samples like this, and they may want to sort of, to try to develop it. So what are the other use cases? Like, what are the other use cases you considered? Why are we developing a federated model? Where can we use it in the future? I know for a fact, I do have a couple of references of individuals and organizations that are not prepared to hand their code base to open AI models for various reasons. Well, their code base is actually good quality. So they obviously need copilots for their developers. So there is certainly a clear demand for federated learning. So they want to grab a cutting-edge model and use it on their data. What stops them from doing a local instance, a local deployment? They don't want that. They say that they want to fine-tune their model to reflect their existing code base. Even running a general-purpose LM locally is a good place to start, but they say that they want a highly specialized model in place. So if you, if you have a narrowly bounded model, its performance will be better. I'm sorry, but the code base belongs to the company, right? So it's probably stored in a single Git. So they take it as an inference for the foundational model. What's the problem? Why would they need federated for that?
Для того, чтобы все равно кодовая база отдельной компании, если этот код...
The code base of an individual company, if it's been developed by humans, and this is certainly their case, I can tell you there are lots and lots of public institutions like this. They all have their own code bases, and they don't really have much high-quality data. So they want to benefit from jointly training their model. Moreover, they're all in a similar situation and they want to save costs by doing it together. So it's like, we want to train our model to co-pilot legacy banking systems together with other banks. Is that a kind of a use case you're talking about? Now you found a very provocative way to illustrate it. No, banks are not really a good example here. How about managing aerial vehicles? All right, cursor for .NET.
Переходя к тебе, вот у тебя было сейчас много итераций с Fluence, как мы поняли. Какой...
I understand that you've gone through many pivots with Fluence. Where are you taking it now?
Слушай, ну я сказал уже, что на самом деле у нас
I've already mentioned
эффективности экономики,
that we are moving towards higher efficiency, financially speaking.
Движение в сторону того, что у нас компьют постепенно заканчивается и...
Because the whole world now is about to run out of compute capacity.
Очень много, все бросили строить дата-центры.
You know, everybody is building data centers now.
Нарисовать котика.
Да-да-да, мы реально прямо сейчас...
Somebody famously said, we are boiling the ocean to draw kittens. And this is so true.
растет, но...
You know, the efficiency of hardware and software is also growing.
Ну, там, по сути, все государства бросились инвестировать.
And still, all the countries are now investing in DC construction.
Не сильно попасть в какую-то ловушку.
Because they don't want to end up in a trap where they depend on somebody else's AI. AI sovereignty
Что хотят иметь.
is something that all states now aspire to have.
Больше думаем про то, а как нам вот
Now we are thinking more about
монополизированную
building an alternative
компьют инфраструктурам платформу, которая поможет
compute platform
двигаться вперед,
that will help the humankind rather than an individual country,
но при этом чуть меньше зависеть от государств, чуть меньше
while being less dependent on states or large corporates.
рационально. Вот.
Where is possible and where is feasible, obviously.
То, чтобы иметь железо, иметь доступ к железу в разных локациях,
So it's about having access to hardware in different locations at the best price. It's about tokenizing hardware. It's about improving, if you like, unit economics
люди, которые его арендуют.
for different stakeholders, including the users and the owners of the hardware.
Больше движемся в сторону экономики вокруг этой истории, потому что железо мы сами делать не можем пока.
И если мы
No, we are not producing our hardware yet.
случай, который ты видишь как проблематику,
So in this respect, we are limited.
доверенный, секьюрный, приватный, и как ты видишь,
So in terms of trusted, secure, and private AI,
будут хотеть люди?
what's your forecast? What will people want in the future?
И люди хотят, то есть confidential computing — это
People do want TEE. Confidential computing
которые появились во всех больших клаудах последние
is a big product now. You know, all the big cloud
спрос на них растет.
providers have been offering it lately, and demand for confidential computing is rising. It is not surprising that so many companies around the world are already in the clouds and they don't want to trust the clouds or entrust their clouds with their confidential data. So they're moving from Amazon EC2 to their confidential computing offer. So we are prepared to pay extra
Там они с NVIDIA
for, you know, some extra guarantees that their data will not be leaked to Amazon or NVIDIA.
как бы эта история, она держится не совсем на криптографии, как вот мы сказали,
And it's not supported too much by cryptography, right?
держится на доверии тому, что
It's supported much more by the trust.
что-то
People are putting in specific players like NVIDIA and Amazon. I mean, there are lots of legal agreements, there are lots of trust crutches, so to speak.
такое внутреннее движение в сторону, да, мы хотим конфиденциальность бизнес
And the industry does want confidentiality of business data,
не у себя, где-то
particularly if computing on top of this data is happening outside the perimeter. Like if we're doing internally, we also want to protect it, to defend our data from our own employees, from insider tampering.
не фанатично, то есть нет никакой фанатичного желания.
But interestingly enough, nobody is fanatic about that.
Неплохо бы.
So the industry treats it as rather a nice to have.
С точки зрения доверенной системы, то есть ты сейчас будешь с Fluence двигаться в этом направлении?
Now, will you be taking Fluence towards a more secure, more confidential environments?
Будет тоже как cloud-продукт, то есть у нас это будет
Yes, we are developing it as a cloud product, so we'll have a confidential computing offer.
сервера, CPU, ты можешь
So we have this, you know, NDA, so like, so to speak, CPUs, where we can have secure VMs for you.
100 GPU, мы можем тебе
Just like we have H100 GPUs, which we can run for you in confidential mode.
Ты целишься в B2B, то есть у ритейла такого запроса по твоему...
And you're targeting B2B with that, right? The retail segment is not interested in that. I'm sorry, retail segment doesn't pay for a compute. We are in the cloud business. There is very little retail there.
Ну, гасуха есть, вот, например, есть
And what about the public sector? Well, the public sector is among our clients for sure. In Latin America, interestingly enough,
сейчас там,
there are very few
ну, вот, например, есть
data centers at the moment. They're building some though now. But in Brazil, for example,
странное регулирование государственное, то есть там
They've got this peculiar regulation.
заградительные пошлины на ввоз желез.
So some time ago, they introduced very high import tariffs on hardware. So buying, say, GPU or any other type of hardware there is extremely difficult. Like, you have to pay taxes, like import fees, that are twice the price of whatever you're bringing in.
Вот, соответственно, там все очень медленно это развивается, и у них
So things are growing very slowly there. So everybody, including the state sector, the public sector,
заливают свои
are hosting,
этим недовольны.
or have their cloud providers in the United States. Can you imagine that?
Да-да-да, то есть у них есть законы персональных данных, то есть
They've got their personal data protection laws,
делать так, что там
so they are trying
группы рождения остаются в Бразилии.
to make sure that, the names and birthdays stay in Brazil while everything else is sent to the United States.
Вот этого
But it appears pretty chaotic.
сейчас
And it does look like they don't have too much in terms of digital sovereignty.
на уровне государственных компаний.
So at the level of the state, at the level of public corporations, they all want to have, local hosting, but it's simply not feasible financially.
Use case на ZKML, который, в принципе, в проде находится там. А WorldCoin, кстати,
Окей.
работает ZKML или нет? Ты сам не щупал?
Vladimir, have you tried ZKML?
Это очень характерный пример. Ну, вот это
Now, WorldCom is a characteristic example.
их описание того, зачем они сделали,
Try.
такой девайс.
I should probably explain here that this is a device which reads your iris,
Там очень интересные модели
retina.
генерируют уникальную ключевую пару.
Then they will generate a unique key pair for you.
Показывает, что ты человек.
So then you should be able to prove that you are who you are.
Это как бы там
So this is like protection against bots.
доказательств вычислений на пользовательских
There is
но там есть очень
no
смежных штук,
proof of compute being done on user devices.
которые явно
125 миллионов долларов они подняли неделю назад или нет?
I think they raised $125 million last week. They don't need to raise anything because they belong to Sam Altman.
несколько миллионов есть людей, у которых эти
So they already have several million people who have agreed for their eyes to be scanned like this.
у этого проекта есть большое будущее, потому что в принципе
So this project certainly has a great future.
дискриминация человека и модели искусственного интеллекта, она есть. И если раньше
There is already this problem of human discrimination.
то сейчас это сделать
Previously you could discriminate between humans and AI using CAPTCHA.
это не помогает.
CAPTCHAs are being replaced every month, but it doesn't really help. CAPTCHA v3 from Google is more behavioral now. So Google effectively remembers what you did on websites. So it sort of relies on this behavioral analysis to pass its judgment.
Для
Now I want to take a step back.
мы на мероприятии
Now, given that this whole event
безопасности сказать, что
is about information security,
процессы, да, есть отдельно обучение, и
I should mention there are two processes which are quite distinct. One is training, and the other one is operation of a trained model.
защите, и там есть свои
There are different ways of securing them,
друг от друга и от потенциальных хакеров.
and there are different stakeholders who want to defend against each other and potential hackers.
Приводится это типа
The most common example is like this. I am using, say, ChatGPT or Cursor or Copilot to generate code. Gen AI obviously is so popular now.
все говорят, ну, все хранится в Амазоне. А что делать, собственно, самому
So we've been talking here about storage of everything at Amazon, but what should Amazon do? Like, imagine that you're running your own model, and there are so many models out there that are potentially doing something useful. Or maybe not. How do you know?
как бы, насколько эти модели полезны, учитывая то, что их сложность как бы
How do we see
росла там на несколько порядков.
how efficient they are? Because the complexity in these models
Там
has grown exponentially. Several years ago, people would use logistic regression to predict weather, and you could at least analyze it. And now you have this black box,
она близка к человеку, причем человеку там с ученой степенью.
which is almost as good as a PhD, for example.
Он, в принципе,
But how can you ascertain whether, it's actually doing what you want it to do? Like you tell it, please help me sort my files on the drive, and it tells you very politely, sure, I'll do that for you.
Французский пакет с вашей Linux-системы.
Yet, first, I am going to delete
Это удаляет как бы
the French package of your system. Now, hopefully you recognize the joke because that will delete your Linux system.
с обучением модели, с приватностью данных, которые в момент, когда там
So there is so much now really related
как бы атаки именно на уровне того, что модель могли обновить, и она начинает делать совершенно не то, что вы хотели.
to, for example, model update-based attacks.
Когда ее обучали,
In fact, when the model was initially trained,
то, что
nobody would guarantee that, it would do exactly what you wanted in 100% of cases. Previously, when computers would do what I instructed them to rather than what they wanted,
Hello World, то теперь я говорю как раз, что я хочу.
like previously, I would give specific commands, and now I'm saying what I want to happen, and the computer does interpretation on its own, and it has its pros and cons.
Может быть исполнен не так, как я как бы на самом
I have to recognize that there are other ways to make my wish come true, and some of them I won't appreciate. So this is what they call LLM alignment.
искать какие-то
I think that with cryptography, we can try sort of searching for problems there.
цепочку
Like I'm thinking of an attack, like a supply chain attack
просто при исходном обучении
happening at, say, the initial train stage or the fine-tuning stage.
там файловой системы.
When, for example, when a user uses a particular term, delete the file system.
И мы непредсказуемым образом
Or maybe the model was just shoddily trained.
теоретически это можно было бы решать тем, что как бы вот
I mean, theoretically,
создать такую вот коробочку sandbox для этой модели, да, песочек.
you can create a sandbox for the model
Вопрос, как вот
and test it there thoroughly.
его не думать об
And still we have this problem that we cannot really go into the mind of the system and see what's there.
По-моему, это очень перспективная тема о том, что
I
можно
think that there is very promising research out there
пытается подумать, то есть все сознание вот этой вот LLM
where you try to follow the chain of thought and see where it's going. So imagine the conscious, quote unquote, of the model is like a big hole, and you identify some corners of the hole as potentially dangerous there.
Узнать твое мнение про...
We have 2 minutes left, and we also need to learn what you think about agents.
Проблемы с конфиденциальностью агентов и вот
Agent confidentiality in particular.
защиты своих данных.
Confidentiality is about your data protection, whether you want to protect it or not.
Выполняется или нет. Если он
But let me put it like this. Much will really depend on whether you're outsourcing it or not, right?
практически это сейчас не работает, к сожалению. Как бы это там 4 порядка разницы в количестве ресурсов. Вот. Если говорить про вот целостность и, в принципе, защиту именно
If we're talking about integrity and comprehensive information security,
некоторые из них, может быть,
I think we need so many layers here. And, some of these layers will be human for sure. Some people may be dreaming that agents will replace humans.
одним контролером, который будет сидеть.
I think that instead of 3 developers, we may have like 1 controller or, one human auditor, so to speak.
опасности
What would you do in terms of confidentiality and security now for agents?
Это один
Cryptography is not,
из этих слоев должно быть очень
an end-all silver bullet, but it's one of the required
импортированным с какой-нибудь далекой
checks and controls.
его
You should be treating agents just like you're treating migrant workers. They come from a different country, they seem to be skilled, but you don't know their biography. You don't know, what has happened to them before they cross the country border. So you need multi-layered defenses.
вычисления. Это, по сути, как бы полиграф, который работает в
The integrity of compute is like a polygraph running in real time. So you gotta be tracking the way it's thinking and making sure you react before it gets somewhere dangerous.